Hilchos Maaseh Hakorbanos Perek Shiva Asar, the laws of sacrificial procedures, chapter 17. Today is the last day we're going to be dealing with Nedarim and Nedavos, the concept of voluntary commitments, how you go about bringing or fulfilling a commitment to bring a voluntary offering. Specifically, we're going to be talking about two concepts. Number one is sticking to the particulars of your vow. When you make a commitment, you got to keep exactly what you said. No variations, even slightly, as we'll see in the beginning of the chapter. And then later on, we're going to move into unspecified commitments, how you go about defining that. Somebody makes an all-encompassing commitment and you don't know how to interpret it. There's halachic parameters as to how we go about interpreting that. So the Rambam begins first with explaining particulars of a commitment. Hanoider halacha aleph, hanoider mincha mafe tanur. If somebody promises to bring a mincha that's oven baked. We saw the last couple of days a few times this chart. This is the 9 types of individual flour offerings. These 4, the first 4 are obligatory, but the last 5 are voluntary. And we're zooming in on this one at the bottom. The oven baked. The person commits to bring an oven baked mincha. Now, because the word is tanur, so we have to follow the halachic definition of a tanur. In halacha, there's different types of ovens. This one at the top right is the classic tanur. Tanur was basically built as a pottery or clay utensil, wider on the bottom, narrower on the top. That way the heat was contained more intensely, and you would bake the bread by sticking the dough onto the sides of the oven. There are other ovens. This one here is called a kupach. Kupach is a range, not wide and narrow. It's just square. It has room for one pot at the top of it, and that was typically how it was used. It was used by putting a pot on top of it and baking it with that. Still, even if it's used as an oven, where you put the food inside, the heat, because it's not contained as intensely, isn't as intense as a tanur. So the Rambam says, when you promise to bring a mincha baked in a tanur, lo yavi mafe kupach. You cannot bring a flour offering baked in a kupach. It's a different type of oven. V'lo mafe ra'afim. You can't bring a mincha that was baked on hot tiles. They used to do this. You put tiles in an oven, you heat them up, they become very, very hot. They contain the heat. You take them out and you use them as little mini ovens to bake stuff on them. If you bake the flour offering on the tile, no good. Additionally, you cannot bring a flour offering that was baked on an Arab oven. An Arab oven is what we call today an earth oven or a ground oven, where you dig a hole in the ground and you put the heating elements inside it and you bake in the hole in the ground. The Arabs used to do that, and that also does not qualify as a halachic oven, and therefore if the flour offering was baked in there, that wouldn't work. Halacha beis. Ha'omer, if somebody says, Harei olai b'machavas, I take upon myself, and this word is operative, Harei olai, he used the neder formulation as we saw, I take upon myself to bring a mincha baked in a shallow pan. Vehevi b'marcheshes, and in the end he brings a mincha baked in a deep pan. B'marcheshes, vehevi b'machavas, I take upon myself to bring a mincha baked in a deep pan, and in the end he brings it in a shallow pan. So, because the obligation never devolved on the actual flour, it was a neder where you took it upon yourself, mashehevi hevi, what you brought was brought, okay. It's kosher to have a flour offering baked in a deep pan. Unlike in the last halacha, it's not kosher to have a mincha baked in those types of ovens. This, you switched your type of offering. But what you brought is kosher. You don't fulfill your obligation. On the other hand, v'im amar, if you would have said, Zula havi b'marcheshes, this flour is going to be brought in a deep pan. V'hevia b'machavas, and to bring it in a shallow pan. Ay b'machavas v'hevia b'marcheshes, or this flour is going to be brought in a shallow pan. And he brings it in a deep pan, harei zu psula. Here, even the offering is disqualified, because you labeled the flour as going to a deep pan, and in the end it went to a different pan. Even though conceptually it's a kosher type of flour offering, but you said this flour is going here, and it went there, so the whole thing is disqualified. And the same thing applies in all similar situations. And the Rambam gives another example of such a situation. So to somebody who says, Harei olai, shnei esreinos, I take upon myself to bring 2 isareins of flour, lahavion bikli echad, and I commit to bring them in one container. Because as we're going to see in a moment, you can bring up to 60 isareins in one container. So he promises to bring 2 in one container. Vehavion bishnei kelim, and in the end he brings them in 2 utensils. Bishnei kelim vehavion bikli echad. Here is the opposite scenario. He promises to bring them in 2 containers. He ends up bringing them in 1 container. Mashehevi hevi v'dechevase leyatza. You haven't fulfilled your obligation because you promised to bring it in a specific way, but because it's kosher to bring a mincha both in 1 or 2 containers, what you brought is okay. Shenemar, as it says, kasher nadarta laHashem. You have to fulfill your obligation as you promised to God. When you didn't fulfill it in the way that as you promised, you don't fulfill your obligation. But again, the flour itself is kosher. However, halacha gimel amar, if you would have said, Elu lahavi bikli echad, this flour is going to be brought, or these 2 isarins of flour are going to be brought in 1 utensil, vehevi bishnei kelim, and you instead brought it in 2 utensils, elahavi bishnei kelim, vehevi bikli echad, or this flour is going to be brought in 2 utensils, and you brought it in 1 in the end, hare elu psulin, that's totally disqualified, because again, you labeled the holiness onto the flour, and you didn't do with the flour what you promised you would do with it. Loikvan b'shas haneder. What if a person promises to bring 2 isarins of flour, but he doesn't label when he made the vow whether he's going to do it in 1 utensil or in 2? Ela Amar, he simply said, Hare alai shnei esrenis. I take upon myself to bring 2 isarins of flour. Ubishas hafrasha, only later when he put the flour aside, that's when kvan v'ifrishan bishnei kelim, he set it aside or established it in a way that he put it into 2 utensils. And then v'chazar v'havion bikli echad, he brings it in the end in 1 utensil. Hare eluk shedim, here it's kosher. Shenemar kasher nadarta v'lei kasher hifrashta. It says you have to fulfill what you promised, not what you put aside. When he promised, when he pronounced the word that I'm going to bring 2 isarins, he didn't have a plan if it was going to be 1 or 2 utensils. And therefore, later on, the fact that he separated this way or that way has no bearings on it. Amar, if a person says, repeat of the earlier scenario, you promised to bring 2 isarins in 1 container, and you end up bringing them in 2 containers. Amru loy bikli echad nadarta. But here there's an additional detail. The people watching said, hey, don't do that. You promised to bring it in 1 utensil. If now he goes ahead and he krivan bishnei kelim, he still brings them in 2 utensils, harei psulin, they're disqualified. He krivan bikli echad harei shedim. If he did it in 1, that's kosher. Here, different to the last time. Last time we said, you didn't fulfill your obligation, but what's brought is kosher. But here, because somebody specifically reminded you and you violated that reminder, the whole thing is disqualified. Similarly, in the other case, Amar halacha daled, if he said, Harei alai shnei esrenis lahavi b'shnei kelim, I promised to bring 2 isarins in 2 utensils. Vehevi bikli echad, and he brings it in 1. Amru le, they tell him, b'shnei kelim nadarta, hey, you promised to bring it in 2. He krivan b'shnei kelim, harei eluk shedim. If he corrects, splits it in 2 utensils, that's kosher. He krivan bikli echad, but if he doesn't correct and puts it into 1 utensil, so one might think that since he violated the reminder specifically, it should be disqualified. Says that Rambam, no. We treat it a little bit lighter here. We treat it like 2 minchas that got mixed. They were supposed to be brought in 2 separate utensils. They mixed into 1. The law of 2 minchas that mix, as we'll learn later in this book, that Rambam says, if you take kmitza separately from both, if you take the proper 3 fingers full of flour from both elements, then it's kosher. Only if you did 1 kmitza, then it's not kosher. Halacha hey, moving on now to undefined commitments. A person says, I promise to bring a flour offering. What's a flour offering? So there's 9 individual flour offerings. So obviously the first 4 are not included because those are obligatory. He's not obligated, he's volunteering. So he has these 5, the 5 voluntary ones. Says the Rambam, Yavi achas mechameshes mine min ochais habayis ben eder unedava. He must bring 1 of the 5 types that can be brought voluntarily. Amar, if a person says, Harei olai min ochais, I take upon myself to bring 2 minchas, Yavi shnei, and I'm going to skip the word mine, Yavi shnei menoches mechamishtan. You have to bring a total of 2 minchas from the 5. And as the consensus in the commentaries is over here, this means you can bring either 2 species or 2 of the same. The Radvaz suggests that maybe you should put in the word mine, shnei mine menoches. It has to be 2 types, because if it wasn't 2 types, then by bringing 2 of the same type, you wouldn't be fulfilling your vow, because 2 of the same type can just be brought in a bigger container. It just becomes 1 of the same type instead of 2. So initially he says that you should put in the word mine, and in this case you have to bring 2 different types. But in the end he also concedes to the Kesef Mishnah's understanding, which is that the Rambam here is saying shnei menoches. You can bring 2, even 2 of the same. Certainly you can bring 2 species, but you can even bring 2 of the same. Now that's if you said mincha or menoches. What if you added another word here? Amar, a person says, Harei olai min menoches. I take upon myself to bring a species, 1 singular species, of plural flour offerings. Yavi shtei menoches mi min echad. Here you have to bring 2 of the same type. Because you said 1 type, 2 minchas. Harei olai minei menoches. If you use both words plural, types of flour offerings, Yavi shtei menoches mishnei minim. You have to pick 2 types and bring 2 of each. V'cheinim amar minei mincha. Same thing if you put the plural word in the beginning. You said types of offering. Yavi shnei minin. Bring 2 types, 1 of each. If you specifically said which one you're going to bring, take upon myself to bring a voluntary flour offering, and you labeled the one that you wanted. Kava nidre b'min mehen ushchachai, and then you forgot which type you said. Maybe chamishtan, you got to bring all 5, just to cover all your bases. Halacha vav, ein hayachid maybe mincha b'kli echad yaser mishishim isarin. When you bring all your flour, you can bring a maximum of 60 isarines per container. A couple of days ago, we learned that you can bring as many as you want. You can commit to bringing even 1,000 isarines if you want. But in one container, you can put no more than 60. If you promise to bring more than 60, maybe shishim bikli echad v'ashar bikli sheni. You fill one up to the max, 60, and then you put the rest in a second utensil. 60 isarines is a tremendous amount. According to some, every isarin is 4 kilo. So we're dealing with a lot of flour. Just for context, this is the picture of the world's biggest cereal bowl, taller than a human being. And this 60 isarines could be about half of this. So this is a lot of flour. Point is, no more than 60 goes into one, and the rest goes into another utensil. Why? Because part of the mincha procedure is belila, to mix the flour with oil. And only 60 isarines can mix well with the oil. More than 60, the sages had a tradition, it won't mix with the oil well. And mixing is an integral part of the mincha procedure. Now the Rambam asks, actually it's not. Even though we said before that technically speaking, if you missed the blila, if you missed the stage of mixing the oil with the flour, it's not essential to the mincha. It's still kosher. So why do we care how many isarins go into a container? Amru Chachamim, the sages said, a very core cardinal principle in halacha, kol haroi lebila ein habila ma'akeves bay. Mixing is only not essential when the mixture could potentially be mixed, less than 60. But if the mixture is such that it couldn't be mixed even if you tried, so if you missed out on it, that's essential. Halacha zayin, Amar, if a person says, I promise to bring 121 isarins. So the Rambam says the ruling is, you have to fill up each container to the max. Maybe me'ah ve'esrim bishnei kelim. Put the first 120 into 2 containers. Go 60 and 60. Shishim b'chal kli, 60 in each one. Or maybe isarin echad b'kli ashlishi, and the last remaining isarin into the third utensil. Amar, if a person says, Harei alai isarin, I promise to bring just one isarin, but you didn't say the word echad. In Hebrew, you just say the word isarin, it's in a singular form. Yavi isarin echad, you have to bring one. Harei alai esrei nois, if you use the plural, I promise to bring isarins. Yavi shnayim, you got to bring 2. Peirash nidra, if you were explicit about your vow, v'shachach kama isarin peirash, but you forgot how many you promised to bring. Yavi shishim isarin bikli echad. You must bring a maximum, 60 in one container. Shachach kama isarin peirash ube'eze min kvoi. If you forgot how many isarins you promised, but you also forgot which category mincha you promised to donate, hareze mevi shishim isarin mikol min v'min michamishtan, you have to bring 5. In other words, each of the 5 types of minchas at the maximum, 60 in one utensil. Kava nidroi. What if you also established how many utensils you're going to bring it in? V'shachach kama esreines nadar v'kama kelim nadar. You forgot how many you promised, how many amounts, and also how many vessels. Hareze mevi me'echad v'ad shishim b'shishim kelim. You have to cover all the variables. You take 60 containers, and in each one you go progressively from 1 to 60. Ketzad, what does that mean? Maybe isarin echad bikli rishon. You put 1 isarin into the first container. Ushnei isarin bikli sheni. 2 into the second container. Ushleisha isarin bashlishi. 3 into the third container. Ad sheyiu ad shishim isarin makli achre, until there's 60 in the 60th one. Because now you've got all the bases covered. It's somewhere between 1 and 60, and you have one utensil for each scenario. If you forgot which type of mincha you promised to bring, maybe I'll say there's shishim kelim mikol min. You got to repeat the process for each category. Oven baked, flat cakes, deep pan, shallow pan. V'nimsa mevi mikol min elef u'shmeina meyes u'shleishim isarim, which is going to cost you from every type 1,830 isarins. Because if you go 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6 plus 7 until 60, 5 times, so for each time it's 1,830. Halacha tes ha'omer, if somebody says, Harei alai minchas sa'idim, I promise to bring a flour offering of barley, which is just not done. You only bring wheat flour. Minchas chatzi isarin, or I promise to bring a flour offering of a half a isarin. Also cannot be done. Has to be a minimum of 1. Minchas b'lei shemen u'levaina, or a flour offering without oil or frankincense, which is forbidden. Harei a pater, you're exempt. Shalei hisnadiv davar shekamayo makrivin. You didn't commit to donate something which is usually brought in the temple, so we just can't do it. Amar, if a person says, I take upon myself to bring a mincha from barley or from lentils, The key difference here is that in Hebrew, you didn't use the construct form. In the first scenario, it's minchas sa'irim, a flour offering which is barley. Here you said mincha min hasa'irim, a flour offering from barley. Ay minha adashim. Ay mincha b'lei shemen u'levaina, or a flour offering without oil and frankincense. But again, you didn't say the word minchas in construct form. Ay mincha chatzi yisarin, or a flour offering of a half a yisarin. Sha'alei said, we ask him as to what his intent was. Im amar, if he says, Lo nadarti ala das shemuter lahaktiv kazeh, the only reason I made this vow is because I thought that's permitted to bring such a thing. Ve'ilu yadati shein makrivin ela yisarin shalem soiles b'shemen u'levaina lo yisinai there. Had I known that you can only bring a full yisarin of wheat flour with oil and frankincense, I would never have made the vow. How is a pater, you're exempt. But if he says, I was simply ignorant. Had I known the proper way to make a vow, I would make a vow anyways. He has to bring it, adjust his vow to bring the way that it would normally be brought. A person promises to bring 1.5 isarins. The Amar, when he's asked, he says, if I would know, I would promise to bring the way people actually bring. You have to bring 2, because you don't bring ever a half of isarin. Once you cross the border from 1, you bring 2. Amar, if a person says, I promise to bring coarse flour, not fine flour. Or I want to bring a half of isarin. But he never mentioned the word flour offering. He's just donating flour. He's exempt, as though he never made a vow. It has no holiness taking effect. So to somebody says, I'm going to bring a Thanksgiving offering with no bread. That's like a salami sandwich without salami. I mean, a Thanksgiving offering has to have bread. I'm bringing a sacrifice with no accompanying libations, which you have to do. You're exempt because you didn't commit to bring a proper sacrifice. But if he said when he was asked, and had I known that you don't bring such a way, and then I would make the promise proper. You have to bring the way it's normally brought. I promise to bring the breads of a Thanksgiving offering. There are 4 types of breads we saw before: the chametz bread, the flat challah breads, the wafer challah breads, the deep fried challah breads. They were all brought with the toida. Here, the person commits only to bring the breads, not the actual offering. Yavi toida v'lachma. You have to bring the offering and the bread. Sha'adavar yadua, because everybody knows she'ein makrivin lechem b'lei toida. You cannot bring bread without a Thanksgiving offering. The seif hakorbanos, and you simply mention the end of the sacrifice, but you meant to bring also the actual offering. Amar, if a person says harei alai lechem lifter toidase shel pleini, he's very clear. I only want to bring the bread so I can exempt somebody else's Thanksgiving offering. I see my friend bringing a Thanksgiving offering. He doesn't have the money to pay for the flour. I'm covering the flour. Yavi lechem toida im toidas chaveri. That's allowed. You can bring the bread with your friend's Thanksgiving offering. Halacha Yud Beis says the Rambam misnadiv v'yineder adam yayin b'fnei atzmai. As we saw in chapter 14, you're allowed to commit to bringing just wine to the mizbeach. But when you commit to wine, ve'ein misnadvin loy yayin v'loy shnei lugin. You cannot commit to bring 1 leg at a time, about 12 ounces or 2, double that. Because we never have anywhere in accompanying libations wine brought in that quantity. You also can't bring 5 leg at a time. Because 5 lug cannot be brought together. Never is there an animal that requires 5 lug, and neither can you divide it to accompany 2 animals. There's no way to divide it. But you can go in increments of 3, 4, 6, and up, because any of those configurations could be divided into specific animals. Because a sheep gets 3 lug, a ram gets 4, an ox gets 6, and once you go past 6, you can divide it into a number that goes either into 3, 4, or 6. Ketzad, let's take a look at this. How would this play out? Nadar Shiva. If a person promises to bring 7 lug, that comes to enough for a lamb and a ram. 3 for the lamb, 4 for the ram. Nadar Shmeina, if you promised 8, you could bring twice for a ram. Tisha, if you went 9, you can divide it 6 and 3, 1 for an ox, 1 for the lamb. Or 3 times a lamb. Nadar Asara, if you went for 10, you can use them 6 for an ox and 4 for a ram. Or 2 lambs and a ram. And you just keep going. 3, 4, and 6 are key numbers that can be played with at any level to divide them into equal amounts. Halacha Yudalid Nadar Chamisha Lugin, if nevertheless a person promised to bring 5 lug of wine, which you just can't do anything with, we tell him, hey, bring another one, complete the 6. Because you've put them, you've established them for a sacrifice. Got to do something with it. But if you did one or two, pater, we just say you're exempt. Because before three, they're not fitting for anything. In case of five, three of them could be used for a lamb. Four of them could be used for a ram. So we say, hey, complete the six to bring it for an ox. But one or two, you haven't even reached the threshold yet. When it comes to oil, you can promise no less than one lug. Because the one lug goes per isarin. When it comes to flour offerings, and the smallest mincha could be one isarin. It means the smallest amount of oil you'll ever need is a lake. So no less than a lake can be promised. If someone says, I promise to bring wine, you can bring no less than three, for the same reason we said before, it's the minimum amount ever brought. I promise to bring oil, no less than a lug. If somebody was specific about how many he's going to bring, and he forgets how much he promised. How many legs should I bring? Yavi arbayim umeya leg. You bring 140. Why 140? She'ein l'chayim. Shemakrivin by hatzibur Hakorbanos merubais yoser miyam tavarishin shel chag shechaliyas b'Shabbos. There is never a day when the Jewish community brings more sacrifices than when the first day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos. And I'll explain why. The first day of Sukkot, you bring 13 bulls as a sacrifice, 2 rams, and 14 lambs. Plus, there's another 4 lambs that are brought. 2 for the daily sacrifice, morning and evening, and 2 for the Shabbos Musaf offering. So I really should have put another 4 lambs here to bring out the point of 18 sheep. It's 13 bulls, 2 rams, and 18 sheep, excuse me. And in that scenario, you bring, in that scenario, 140 loig of oil, in the same amount of wine, as will be explained in the laws of the daily sacrifice and additional sacrifices. And I put it over here, the numbers. Every bull gets 6 loig. If you go 6 times 13, plus 4 times 2, plus 3 times 18, comes out to 140. And therefore, if you made an undefined donation of wine or oil, you bring the maximum the Jewish community would ever bring, which is 140 loig of wine or oil.